Equality in the workforce isn't an equally distributable commodity for the LGBTQ community. Nearly 1 in 10 LGBTQ plus workers in the United States have experienced workplace discrimination within the last year, and almost half have experienced some form of employment bias throughout the duration of their career. The findings were published in a report in September of 2021 entitled LGBT People Experience Workplace Harassment and Discrimination at the Williams Institute at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. It found that 46% of LGBTQ plus workers reported receiving unfair treatment because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, being passed over at work for promotions, being passed over for a job, being harassed at work, and denied a raise or access to company events, or even being fired. Dr. Steve Yacovelli is on a mission to change the way we look at the LGBTQ plus community in the workforce. For the past 15 years, he's been fiercely dedicated to amplifying the inclusion of the gay community in the workforce. He is the owner and principal founder of the Top Dog Learning Group, with a mission of working in the training, teaching, and learning development space, working with clients both big and small to diversify their understanding of the importance of inclusive leadership and a diverse perspective in the workplace. If you don't walk away from this conversation with Yacovelli feeling inspired and motivated to be more inclusive while you're at work, then, my friends, I'll have to make you an appointment to go see a doctor, because combined with Yacovelli's energy, efforts, and enthusiasm, there's no doubt that you walk away with a totally different perspective, which is rooted in the principles of inclusion and equal representation for all. So without further delay, I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, my friend, and I'm super excited to learn how you're being a leader in the space of cultivating more employment and inclusive opportunity for the gay community, my friend. It's lovely to meet you, and thank you so very much for a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I am so excited to be here and have a chat with you.
Absolutely, my friend, and I know that you've been in the field of leadership for over 30 years, and I know that your book, Pride Leadership, looks at cultivating talent for more LGBTQ plus community members. So I'm curious if you can tell me about the book, your work, and why you think this topic is so vitally important.
Yeah, thank you for asking, Kevin. So, my latest book, I should say, because the next one's in the works, but my latest book, Pride Leadership Strategies for the LGBTQ, as we say in French, leader to be the king or queen of their jungle. It actually started, it wasn't going to be a gay book, to be honest with you.
Okay.
It was in, I guess it was in the closet if we really put it correctly. But
Part of the fun, right?
yeah, no, totally on purpose, totally on purpose. But I've been, as you said, I've been in this space for about 30 years, and over that time, worked with lots of leaders, mostly with Fortune 500s, large not-for-profits, both here in the States, in Canada, and as well as beyond. And you start to see a pattern of behavior, and you see what's working and what's not, for leaders in general. And so, I started looking at these 6 competencies, and for those who aren't watching the visual, it's authenticity, courage, empathy, communication, relationships, and culture. And so I started seeing these pop up on all the leaders I'm playing with, over the years. And then I went to some events here in Central Florida, where I'm from, that were with gay leaders, and meaning gay, of course, in the most general sense of the word. And Kevin, do you remember the Sex and the City, the first TV series, Sex and the City?
Of course I do. I'm a child of the 90s, so I watch it all the time. Absolutely.
Perfect. So you'll relate to this, and as I'm sitting there watching these queer leaders do their thing, my little inner Carrie Bradshaw went off. And, she always used to start her MacBook. I couldn't help but wonder. And that's kind of what was in my head while I'm watching these LGBTQ plus leaders do their thing. And I couldn't help but wonder, is there something to the general term queer experience that allows you to exercise the 6 competencies maybe in a different way? And so I stopped doing the generic leadership book, did I'm not a fan of the word pivot since COVID, but did a pivot, and really focused on the leadership of these 6 competencies through the rainbow lens. And that's kind of how Pride Leadership was born and came out of the closet, I guess.
Steve, I also wanted to ask you about the impact of the pandemic on the gay community, because I know that it had a specific effect on your community at large, and I'm wondering if you could share some thoughts there as well.
It's a really interesting question, and I think there's so much in the parallels of isolationism for many different folks, and whether you are you have your family or the family you've made, when COVID hit and we all had to start to isolate, I think there was a lot of isolationism for many folks, and I saw that especially with my friends in bigger cities. I of course did a lot of Zooming before COVID, and of course during COVID and such. And I would see my friends like in Paris, and gay friends in Paris who were just like, I have no outdoor space and I'm locked in my little tiny apartment. And so that kind of stuff I think really lended itself to people really trying to reach out in different ways. But I would think that there's beyond the rainbow community, around the rainbow family, a lot of folks who maybe didn't have friends or weren't living with free people, or their spouses were there, or had those roommates, might have also felt that same challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve, one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast is I'm a big believer in developing social capital and getting rid of isolationism. And as I shared with you before we started recording, buddy, I was born with cerebral palsy, and one of the reasons I started the podcast was I wanted a way to build my social network, because a part of my disability, sometimes it's harder for me to get outside. So I'm just curious to ask you about the importance of building social capital and community as it relates to the LGBTQ community as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the silver linings of what happened because of the pandemic, and it really forced us to look at how we're networking and building that community and engaging in that social connectivity differently. And I think my doctorate's actually in instructional technology and distance education, and I remember very, very specifically on the very first class of my doctoral program, my professor said, distance learning, distance education, what we're doing right now really will never ever replace the in-person experience. Of course not. But our goal as distance educators is to get as close to it as possible. Now, flash forward to COVID, and that's kind of what we've been doing. We've been using tools like Zoom, like Teams, like whatever, FaceTime, all this stuff to connect with people. And I think that's the beautiful side of this is, like I taught my 70-plus-year-old parents how to FaceTime during the pandemic. Now, they always had iPhones, but we never thought about it. And then because of the pandemic, my dad's a woodworker. And I'm like, Dad, go build a stand so I'm not looking up your nose when I FaceTime you. So the next call he did, and he built his stand, and he was all proud of himself. And that's now how we communicate all the time. And I think that connection to see people's eyes, to hear their voice and see them as best you can, just those different ways that we're engaging, I think is really built community in a new and wonderful sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Steve, I've been waiting all afternoon to ask you this question. So Tell me, how did you gain the nickname the Gay Leadership Guy? I'm fascinated.
So it's a weird and awesome story. It actually touches upon my book as well. So I was at the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce conference, my first time in Philadelphia in 2018. And in between sessions, I'm kind of sorting the business cards like one does outside of a session. And there's a woman next to me doing the exact same thing. And she comes up to me and she's like, what's your name? I'm like, oh, Steve, her name is Jen. And she's like, what do you do? Oh, consulting, blah, blah, blah. How about you? And she's like, well, I'm a publisher. I'm like, there's a leadership book in my head that has to come out. She's like, let's get that book out. And that's how I met Jennifer Grace of Publisher Purpose Press, and actually, who I ended up publishing Pride Leadership through. But as we're going through the process and, editing and all that stuff, one point during the conversation, Jen asked me, she's like, well, what's your personal brand? I'm like, well, Top Dog Learning Group, that's my business. She's like, no. Your personal brand, what is it? And I was like, well, I don't have one. She's like, well, you need one, because you think about it this way. You'll have this great book. You need some sort of brand and way to acknowledge, because that will always be your book. It's not your business's book. And I said, well, I like leadership. The book's about leadership, and I'm gay, and I self-identify as a dude. And she's like, you're done. And so that's kind of how the Gay Leadership Dude was born. And I love it because as a white cisgendered gay dude, you may not necessarily know that I'm, part of a underrepresented group. And so by using the title, The Gay Leadership Dude, it is all out there. I mean, you automatically know I like leadership, I self-identify as a dude, and I'm gay. So there you go.
Oh, well, that's quite the story. It actually made my afternoon. So thank you for that.
Thank you for asking.
Absolutely. Hey, Steve, I'm also curious to ask you, what do you think it means to have an emotional courage as a gay community? What do you think it means to have emotional courage in your community?
It's a beautiful question. And if I think about it, I go back to the 6 competencies that we talk about in Pride Leadership: authenticity, courage, empathy, communication, relationships, and culture. Kind of the way I'd answer that question is it's all about authenticity. And so I think as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, if you're being your authentic self in the workplace, beyond the workplace, that takes courage. And I think that having that opportunity and that courage to really say, this is who I am, this is what I stand for, this is what's important to me. It's a facet of who I am, but knowing and honoring that, I think that authenticity is beautiful and powerful.
Yeah, and you also say it's time to sort of turn the channel when we talk about the qualities of developing gay leadership and gay leadership talent. So I'm wondering if we can dive into that for me this afternoon.
Yeah, when you think about developing talent in general, especially for underrepresented minorities, those are the people who are out in front advocating for benefits, for the right voice, the seat at the table, being heard and being seen. And so how do you get seen and heard and really make change? It comes through leadership. It comes through these 6 competencies: being authentic, being empowering, communication, building relationships, how you shape that culture. And I think you can't make the move to be in more inclusive workplace or society without having that specific leadership, but more importantly, leadership that understands the quote unquote otherness. And so we need people like yourself who are leadership in people with differing abilities. We need the LGBT leaders to share, hey, this is what we're looking at. We need women, we need people of color, all those leaders saying, this is our perspective and this is how we can make it better. I think that's where the leadership piece comes into play. And we have an opportunity to develop that talent within our own communities.
Yeah, Stephen, and one of the reasons I wanted to have a chat with you today was to explore the idea of inclusion for all people in the workforce. As I shared with you as we started recording, I was born with cerebral palsy, and I also have worked with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce on inclusive employment for folks with disabilities. So when you look at the word inclusion in the workforce, how do you think we can incorporate more people with disabilities and people within the gay community as well?
I mean, it goes to that concept of empathy, and that's again, as a white cisgender dude, I'm so happy and thankful that I'm gay because it helped me really understand and see some of that others. I will never understand the experience fully of someone with cerebral palsy or with a person of color or my female colleagues in the workplace. Of course not. But can I be the best ally I can? I'm trying, and I think through that it starts with that empathy piece. And then it goes to listening. And so I think if we're going to create inclusive workplaces for people with different abilities or any of the other pieces that looks at diversity, it's having that empathy, but also having open ears and listening to the plights. One of my best friends taught me a gorgeous lesson. She unfortunately passed away, but she had MS. And she taught me so much about her experience using a wheelchair and what that looks like. And because of her friendship and because of the time her and I spent together, every time I go walking literally through my neighborhood and someone's blocking the sidewalk, I get mad because I'm like, Meredith couldn't walk here, she couldn't move here, and then she'd have to go into the street, and that's dangerous. And so I started having that empathy for her experience, and that's I think what any of us can do in order to be a more inclusive leader is have that empathy and then listen to what the needs are and how can we be that ally either in front of, next to, or behind people who have differing needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Steve, I want to know all about Top Dog Learning Group, my friend, because I know it's all about building a sense of community in the workplace and beyond for the LGBTQ community. So I'm wondering if you can tell me about all the good work that you do.
Thank you. It's funny because as you and I talked about at the beginning here, Kevin, today's the 15th anniversary of Top Dog Learning Group. So I've been doing this little doghouse. Thank you. Doing this little doghouse show for dog show, I guess, for 15 years. But basically, our little doghouse sits in the center of 3 different but stupidly complementary areas. We focus on leadership and organizational development. We look at diversity and inclusion and creating that sense of belonging in the workplace. And then we also look at change management and being resilient in times of change. And we do one, if not all 3 of those through a variety of different channels. We do custom training classes, things off the shelf, group coaching, all that good stuff. And as I said, we primarily work with large Fortune 500, large not-for-profits. And really the overarching theme is helping to create more consciously inclusive leaders, period. So that could be queer folks, that could be our straight friends, and everybody in between and what that looks like. But really helping to make more inclusive leaders who then can make more inclusive workplaces and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Shiv, I also want to ask you about attitudinal barriers. And how do you think we can change attitudinal barriers for people who work in human resources or who make hiring decisions within the workplace?
It's a really interesting and thoughtful question, and I have seen several even HR professionals who aren't the best at being inclusive, quite honestly. And in one of my signature talks I do, in my keynotes, I kind of broke it down into three spots. And I love that you asked this question. We didn't prompt this, which is kind of lovely, but it's really thinking the process through three different lenses. You think in, you speak up, and you act out. And I think for that HR leader or whomever, it's the thinking is thinking about your own biases and your own house and getting that in order. If you're listening to this or watching this podcast, and you're breathing, you have a bias somewhere. You could be the most amazing HR professional in the world. You could spend all of your time in the D&I space, but you have bias because that's how us humans are wired. So the thinking is figure out which ones you have and then work to debias yourself through a lot of different strategies. The speak up is having that courage, as we talked about, to call things out when you see them and not engage in silent collusion. Someone says a derogatory thing toward any group, and if you don't say something, you don't speak up, then you're silently supporting it. And we can't do that. If we're going to create inclusive workplaces, you have to have that courage to provide that feedback and to say, you know what? No, that's not what we're going to say. That's not really a thing. Or even just asking a question like, what did you mean by that statement? Because a lot of times people are coming at these from that unconscious and they don't realize what they're saying. And then act out is how do we actively go into our workplace, go into our communities, go into our spaces, and see how inclusive are they? Are they inclusive of someone who uses a wheelchair? Are they inclusive of somebody who's queer and has a same-sex partner? Are they inclusive of people who don't have children? One of the things that I thought was really cool recently is I'm seeing more and more of my clients as one of their minor policy changes is including pet bereavement as part of their policy. And now some people be like, well, so what? I don't have human children in this lifetime, but I have canine children, and they are just as important to me. And when I started seeing that, I'm like, you know what? You're seeing a part of me and who my experience is. And that's a great example of the act out. It can be big and small stuff. What are your trans healthcare? But little things too can go a long way to create that inclusive space. So that think in, speak up, and act out.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve, I'm also fascinated to get your perspective on the phrase representation matters and what that means to you.
As a kid who grew up in the 80s, I didn't see a lot of queer folks on TV. And I'm so thankful that while we still have very far to go, that representation of so differing types of individuals is being put out there. The fact that Mattel is now creating different kinds of Barbies with different skin tones and different sizes, beautiful. You see Target having Halloween costumes made for children who use a wheelchair, beautiful. And those little things are, some people are like, well, why does it matter? Well, it matters to that child. It matters to that young woman. And that's where I think the beauty is happening. And as much as people downplay social media and kind of poo-poo Facebook and Twitter and Twitch and all those fun things, what it has done is allow us to see that visibility of the variety of different folks who are out there. And I think that's one of the blessings of it. And that connected piece of it, that you can find your pack, as we like to say at Top Dog, fairly easily within any of these social media channels. And so I think not only seeing that representation in the mainstream is important, but also finding your pack as you identify, I think is as equally important in this day and age.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Sid, I'll just share something briefly about myself. One of my title mottos that I live my life by is that inclusion is the gateway to independence, and really providing everyone a platform to share their story. One of the reasons I got into journalism, first of all, Steve, was I'm a big sports guy, so I originally went to school to become a sports reporter, and I found out at 9 years old when I had my final leg operation that I wouldn't be able to walk. And I remember it like it was yesterday because the doctor who had performed my surgery had put me into a conference room and told me that I wouldn't be able to walk. And then the next day I had to go back to school. And the principal at the time, her name was Dr. Carol Crowley, and she looked at me and she said, after I had gone through this spiel of what the doctor had said and what it meant for the rest of my life, she looked at me and she said, the only limitations you'll have on your life are the artificial ones that you place on yourself artificially. And I really think that was the trajectory turning point in my life. So when you look at independence in the workforce, how do you define it for your community and for all people at large?
Yeah, that's a great story. Thank you for sharing. And that's an awesome educator right there. It's a beautiful example of what people who are working with youth need to do. Is to say, get rid of that. You can do this. It might be a different path, but you can do it. I love that. And I think that would be the response I have is, someone being their authentic self in the workplace may be different than the norm. So what? I think that's the opportunity that we have. I was working with one of the things that we do at Top Dog Learning Group and as the Gay Leadership Dude is I took Pride Leadership as a book, and it's actually now the textbook for an online leadership program that we do called the Lions Program. And so I'm working with queer leaders from all over the globe all the time, and I love it absolutely. And we had that conversation about how do I balance my authenticity with the expectations in the workplace. And I said, yes, you have to manage that. It's all about context, but don't ever sacrifice who you are. And the beautiful thing is, if you're in a workplace that is telling you to try to conform, there's lots of other places that will value that authenticity that you have. And I think that you're starting to see more and more of that in smart businesses. And you're also starting to see that because of the pandemic, that not every job, of course, but a lot of folks are like, you know what? I don't feel that I have that sense of belonging here. Well, I can pick up my toys and virtually go over there where I know that they more value my difference and my perspective. And I think that that's the trend we're starting to see. And people's saturation points for putting up with uninclusive workplaces, it's getting less and less. And I think, yes, there's geography involved. Yes, there's different professions. And I'm making a gross generalization, of course. But I think the trend is that people are like, no, I want to be in a more inclusive workplace. I want to work with people who have more broader perspectives on what differences are and how we can leverage them to be more inclusive, to have different opinions, and quite frankly, you make better money if you're, as a business, more inclusive and all those different voices and perspectives. So I think we have that opportunity to kind of see that and sense that, but really giving that space for people to flex their authentic selves and honoring that, but then also educating those who maybe aren't as inclusive to say, you know what, there's advantages to us being more inclusive. And oh, by the way, look at the values that are on the website that our business says we value different people. And if you don't value that, there's maybe an opportunity to rethink your job, because workplaces that state that we embrace inclusivity but don't, they can't hold that secret any longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve, I'm fascinated to ask you about how you hope the ascension of the acceptance and inclusion of gay people in the workplace and beyond will continue to evolve and improve. How do you hope it improves moving forward?
Yeah, and I think I could answer both questions with kind of the same thing, which is kind of funny. What you're starting to see, and where I think the future is so much less about this performative allyship. And you have that with any ally kind of situation, where performative allyship is the act of for example, throwing a rainbow over your logo for the month of June. And then July 1st, you remove that logo and it's back to business as usual. Let's give money to the anti-queer, politicians down the road. And so what you're starting to see is a lot less tolerance for that anymore. And I just saw it on LinkedIn, like this week. Someone was saying, it was actually in the holdover conversation from the World Cup, and how certain brands were just like, yay, we're sponsoring the World Cup. But gee, World Cup in Qatar is not the most inclusive place for queer folks. And so you have a lot of really big companies who are waving their rainbow flags in June. one that just made a very significant donation to an LGBT professional group, but then they were also sponsoring the World Cup, and a very, you know, and which of course was squashing a lot of queer voices and things of that nature. So I think you know, the tolerance level is getting less and less, and what the trend for that I see is that less and less tolerance for performative allyship for any of the other groups, and really seeing what happens. You know, we at the time of this recording here in the States, it's Black History Month, and so, you know, I'm curious to see what that looks like from a performative allyship, and how people are going to get called out on it, given some of the events and all the different areas of focus for people of color, and really elevating those voices, because the trend is that tolerance is pretty thin now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Steve, a lot of President Biden's signature accomplishment was to make sure that LGBTQ people were awarded the same federal protections through the Equality Through Marriage Act. So, as a married gay dude, I'm just curious about your perspective on that achievement and how far we've come in that regard.
Yeah, it's a start. It's definitely a very big difference in the previous administration. I'll just leave it at that. But there's still so much more to go. And you know, as we here in the States continue to fight a divided government, a lot of times it's not just at the federal level. As you know, I'm sitting here in Florida. Florida is a horrendously anti-LGBTQ state, you know, at least according to the state legislator, and of course our governor. And so those fights need to happen. So for every marriage equality thing that happens, yay, Biden administration, you know, there's lots of other fights that are happening that really need our attention and focus. And so I never want to just, you know, not accept and congratulate and honor the efforts that took, because I know personally people who helped with that. However, there's still so much more. I mean, you know, trans kids are just being totally harassed in this country. That needs to stop. You know, then on the positive side, just this week, the Biden administration put forth to all departments that they had to include and think about how they're including LGBTQ plus data in their collection of what they do. So when you look at the housing administration, how are they looking at people who are unhoused through the queer lens, and what is the data on that, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yay, that's a great win. But then you have in many states, including my own, where they're banning books that have queer characters. And so, you know, it's for every win, there's every step forward, there's several steps back. And that's why we have to continue that fight and pull in our allies, who I know are listening, to really help us, all of us others, band together and really support the rights that each one of us has to be equal and equitable and have that seat at the table, because there's a heck of a lot more of us together than there are of them who are trying to fight against us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve, tell me, I'm curious to ask you about how do you think we can get more LGBTQ folks in positions of leadership in the workforce? How do you think we can accomplish that goal?
It's a slow process. You know, I know one of my personal agenda items is to sit on a corporate board of directors. So I've done some research. I got a certificate from Harvard on that, underrepresented minority in the corporate board space. And so, you know, it starts all over. It's not just in the C-suite. It's in the boardroom. It's at that factory level leadership. And I think it's creating those opportunities. It's developing the leadership skills, of course, but it's also creating those opportunities for any of the others to kind of take the wheel and have that opportunity to lead the organization or department or division, but definitely needs to, as you progress further up the org chart, to make sure that it's not just the middle-aged white dudes. And no disrespect meant to my middle-aged white dudes. Hey, I guess I am one. But, you know, really creating that space that, you know what, maybe it's time to step down, or to give that seat to somebody else. Or, hey, maybe we need to add 3 more board seats and make sure that they are filled with underrepresented minorities, and better represent the markets that we're in. So I think it's awareness and creating that space at a variety of spaces within the organization.
Yeah, and Steve, my final question for you has to do with your own personal and professional legacy and how you want that to be defined.
That's wow. You know, I would love 15 years from now for someone to say, "Oh my gosh, you're that gay leadership dude still." You know, I'm writing more books to try to leave that legacy, and to leave a mark, and to hopefully inspire and help other folks. You know, I think the more I do professional speaking, and meet different folks, and even virtually meet different folks, for people to hear the story, and say, you know what, you made a difference. I had a coachee literally this week, one of the people who was in my Lions program, and she said, you know, it was right at the end of January, of course, and she was talking about, oh, dry January and all the stuff that she did. She says, I'm in such a good spot in my life, and I'm not just saying this to blow my own horn. I truly was touched. She said, but you know what? Going through this leadership program helped me really start to see myself differently, and that I am a leader. And yes, I'm kind of just sort of entering the workforce, but I will be in a leadership role down the road. I know it. And she's like, I'm going to seize those opportunities that get me that one step further, because now I have that courage and confidence. And I'm like, yes. So those little pieces to me are part of the bigger picture. Sure, I want people to remember my name. That'd be nice. Yacovelli is not a very common name, so at least I have that going for me. But just for those, you know, little tiny times I impacted someone's world for the better, that's the legacy I'd like to make sure I leave.
Yeah, absolutely. And tell me, Steve, if people want to get connected with the good work that you do, my friend, what's the best way they can do that?
It's pretty easy. If you just go to topdoglearning, all one word, .biz, B-I-Z, you can find out about me, about my team, the books and the trainings we do, book some time to have a chat. So that's topdoglearning.biz.
Fantastic. Well, Steve, I have to tell you, you gave me a shot of adrenaline and a lot of great advice on how to create a more inclusive workforce for the LGBTQ community. I want to thank you for your work in this space. And Tom, on my behalf, it's most appreciated, my friend. I got a lot of great information, and it was lovely to meet you this afternoon.
You too. And Kevin, keep doing the great work that you're doing as well. I think it takes all of us singing from that same songbook of inclusivity to make the world that little bit better. So thank you for the work that you're doing.